So most videos that you're finding on YouTube are all about the best neighborhoods or maybe the hidden local spots in the Denver area. Well, guess what guys? This one's gonna be a little bit different. And if you're thinking about moving to Denver, these are actually the 3 areas I think you should avoid or at least understand before buying. Now, not because they're bad places. In fact, I have clients that absolutely love living in every one of these areas that we're gonna talk about today. But they also come down with one major trade-off, and that catches a lot of buyers completely by surprise. So today we're actually gonna be talking about 3 of these. First, we're gonna be talking about Candelas in Arvada and the history of Rocky Flats. Number 2, gonna be talking about some of the neighborhoods located in the Foothills on that far western side of Denver. And then number 3, why buying a downtown Denver condominium might cost way more each month than you think. Now, everything I'm sharing today, from the public info to today's housing market, and just what we're really seeing week after week right now with helping relocation buyers move to Colorado, the goal is not just to tell you where not to live by any means at all. That is not the goal here. The goal is simply just to help you avoid maybe buying in a place that just doesn't really fit your specific lifestyle. So excited to share all this with you guys on a brand new episode of Living in Denver. Let's get going. All right, so before we jump into all this, really quick guys, all that info down below, feel free to reach out. I love making videos every week and also just really love connecting. If you guys are considering coming out here, I know I've got some value to provide you when it comes to resources and just some local insights. So don't be a stranger, reach out, but let's just talk first about the number 1 of these 3 areas to potentially avoid depending on just what's really important to you. And that's gonna be in Arvada, specifically the Candelas development, which is formerly Rocky Flats. Now, decades ago, Rocky Flats actually manufactured plutonium triggers for nuclear weapons. And this was actually during the Cold War, and they shut this all down back in 1989. Now, eventually it actually underwent one of the largest environmental cleanup projects in the United States history. It actually cost over $7 billion, that's with the B, before becoming what is now known as the Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge. So, a lot of people have mixed opinions on this. Some people think it's totally fine. Other people, they just want to kind of avoid this part of the Denver area. Now, regardless of what side of the fence you're on, I think what's important to understand is that today in the federal government, they're considering the surrounding public areas safe. So there's no concerns from the federal government at this point. And, thousands and thousands of people, they are happily living here in that area, in that surrounding area. But, here's the thing. There are a lot of Colorado locals who simply aren't comfortable with living near something like this, like a nuclear weapons facility. Sounds kind of crazy when you say it like that. And honestly, this is probably one of the most common questions that I get from relocation buyers that are moving to this side of town, if they're even familiar with it. So, whether your concerns are based on something like this, something that's kind of scientific, or maybe it's something about history or just simply perception, I think it's really important to understand this before buying. And this is why I think it matters more than anything. It's because even if you're completely comfortable with it, you always have to remember, what is a future buyer going to think about this? Perception always does affect resale value of homes. So even if maybe only 10 or 20% of buyers immediately, can kind of see this neighborhood as one they don't want to live in and they can cross it off their list, well, that still is affecting the buyer demand for that neighborhood. It still changes and adjusts that pool of active buyers. And when it comes time to sell, that could affect the price that you're able to get for your home when you go to resell it. So that was a good starting point, talking about that Candelas area in Northwest Arvada. Now I want to talk about another area that's also on the western side of town, and that's really just the entire Foothill range of all of the neighborhoods on that side of town. So again, thinking about areas like Evergreen, Conifer, Bailey, maybe even parts of Golden. Even when you're in that northwestern part of Arvada, just that far edge on the western side of Arvada even, a lot of these areas get affected by insurance, specifically not just the cost of insurance, but sometimes whether or not they're even capable of getting the home insurance. Now, to take it even a step further, Colorado is also constantly ranking among the top states in the nation for the most expensive states to have homeowners insurance. And it's not even close to where it was just a few years ago. Since 2018, so we're looking at about 8 years ago, average homeowner insurance premiums have actually increased by about 60%. Now, when you dig deeper into this and wonder a little bit more about why this is, it's, well, because insurance companies aren't just, worried about the wildfires anymore. They're also worried about other things like hail, as an example. We just got through the month of June a few weeks back, and June is always, notorious for being one of the worst months in the state of Colorado for hail. I live in the southwestern side of Denver in Littleton, and man, a couple of years ago, I think it was 2023, maybe it was 2024, we had a massive hail storm here in this part of Denver, and it actually got to the point where nearly every house in my neighborhood had insurance claims the following year. You have to make that claim within 12 months. So there's all the homes in my neighborhood that got basically brand new roofs, and in my case, not only a brand new roof, I was able to almost get my entire windows in the house also replaced under my insurance claim. I got about 90% of them replaced. There was a few that were underneath kind of overhangs where the hail didn't directly impact them. So a few they didn't consider in the claim, but significant just costs associated with this, and also just something to be very, very aware of when you guys are considering coming out here. Now, when talking about just whether or not some of these insurance companies will even insure you, this is going on across the nation. You're hearing other stories about this in Florida with hurricanes, stuff like that. But in Colorado, the big one again is these wildfires and just the concerns that really didn't exist even just 10 or 15 years ago, at least not to the scale that it is today. And we can go down a whole different rabbit hole on that, but a lot of reasons for this. One of them, in addition to just environmental changes that people are considering being a big part of this, another thing is also just that Denver and Colorado are so popular that it would continue to grow and expand and expand and expand our population. With more people, that sometimes means going into areas of these foothills that are not properly mitigated for fire. Sometimes homes are built too close together. A lot of other issues like that. You're seeing this really, really big right now also in California, especially after all those recent fires in Malibu. Same issues going on there. So I think it's super important if you do come out here and you find some homes that are interesting, that are maybe in this foothills area, just doing some due diligence. And I can help with this, making sure that this home could even be covered. And if so, what are the costs associated with that? Some carriers have just reduced their coverage while others have completely stopped writing policies in these certain mountain communities. And, again, this can easily add several $100s each month to your housing payment. And that's before you even factor in some of these other costs like your mortgage, your property taxes, et cetera, et cetera. Now, when I'm talking about this foothills part of Denver, just one last thing that I'll share that I think also doesn't get talked about enough, and that's understanding that if you're buying in these areas and you're still going to be commuting, if you're still going to be working, or maybe it's not work, maybe it's even just your social life, dropping kids off at different places or whatever it may be, understanding that this does incorporate a little bit longer commute when you're in the foothills. Now, maybe when you're back home in a different state, just kind of researching, and you type in Google Maps, how long does it take to drive from a mountain community like maybe Genesee or again, Evergreen to downtown Denver, just trying to see some of these hypothetical drive times. Yes, that is probably true on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of the summer, but throw in a snowstorm, throw in a big accident on one of the highways that you need to take to get down into Denver, like I-70 or Highway 285. Maybe it's also the weekend ski traffic on I-70 that you might still be getting caught up in depending on where exactly you live. And maybe it's also something just like you're suddenly looking at 60, 70, 80-minute commute times, depending on, the time of year. So it's really important to understand that commute times are one thing when you search them online, but there's a reality to them as well. And just understanding that sometimes it's going to take you a little bit more, windshield time just in your car to get to and from places when you live up in these foothill type communities. All right, so now we're ready for that third and final one. And this is something that's been in the news a lot over the last few years for lots of different reasons. And that's just understanding that the cost of living, specifically real estate related in the downtown Denver area, is insane. I mean, we are seeing a lot of changes happening right now in this specific section of the Denver metro area. And, the pricing of the homes is really only part of the equation here. It's very, common in these bigger type communities, big buildings. Maybe it's an apartment, or maybe it's even some areas that are just outside of the downtown part of Denver that just have, rows of townhomes, that kind of stuff. I'm trying to make the point that there are significant costs with HOAs, and sometimes these are as much as even $1,000 or more per month. We see this in other areas around Denver, but I feel like the HOA specifically to these more very urban type areas that are more densely populated, man, seeing some crazy high HOAs, and something that you just really have to factor in when it comes to whether or not that property makes sense, again, from an affordability and long-term investment perspective. I think one way to look at this, if you are in an area like the more downtown core where you're buying a home that has an HOA and you're okay with that potentially, well, the bigger question is just, what does it cover? What value am I getting out of paying, several $100s, if not even higher than that, per month? And sometimes it can be justified for, again, the right buyer. Maybe it's amenities that you're paying for, like maintenance, security that might be really important to you, fitness centers, pools, concierge services, maybe heated garages, and different ones of these that I'm talking about. Some really do, provide a lot of value to their tenants, and people really appreciate that stuff and they're willing to pay. But man, the worst is just getting stuck with the high monthly HOA and you're not even using it. So for example, the pool and the fitness center, maybe you already have a different place that you go and you don't actually use the one at your building. Maybe it's the heated garage, which, yeah, it's nice, but is it really that important? Just really understanding just what's most important for you guys, and then understanding if that HOA makes sense. Because again, this is existing all over Denver, but the metro, downtown part of Denver is one that's really getting hit hard right now when it comes to the cost of owning homes there because of things like these high HOAs. Now, one little caveat or just extra final point that I want to make on HOAs is understanding that it's very important to do your due diligence on understanding how healthy that specific HOA is that exists in the building or in the community that you're trying to buy a home in. There's a lot of other factors to consider, especially in this downtown Denver area, because the monthly HOA sometimes isn't actually what's the most concerning. It's whether or not the HOA has enough money saved in their reserves, because a lot of these older downtown buildings eventually are going to need more capital improvements, whether it be new roofs, maybe replacing elevators, which can be very, very expensive, parking garage repairs, balcony repairs, maybe bigger scale plumbing replacements in the building, HVAC. It can go on and on and on here, but just understanding that if the HOA isn't properly saving enough money in their reserves, then man, you could buy a home in this type of community and get hit with a massive bill when they have new capital improvements where they do a vote, and oftentimes it comes down to just being a requirement. You have to pay what got added to the HOA. So just something to think about. I'm getting a little anxiety just talking about it here with you guys, because I've had some different clients over the years that have really had this be a big factor in deciding whether to or whether not to move forward and buy a condominium or a home that had a high HOA. Now, before we close this one out, I just wanted to give you guys one little bonus tip. This is something that I think is really good to share with you guys here at the end of the video, because I didn't want this to be a doom and gloom type video. Yeah, these are 3 reasons why you might not want to come here, but I think what's the bigger piece of this is just understanding that if you're aware of these and you're intentional about addressing them and making them still fit your lifestyle and what's important to you, then yes, Denver and Colorado are still amazing places to live. That's why I'm still here after 43 years, and just it's an incredible place to be. So I do want to end it with this though, just something that I share with pretty much every relocation buyer that I ever work with, and that's understanding that a bad house can almost always be remodeled, to some extent. However, a bad neighborhood, that is a whole lot harder to fix. So what's so important is just spending the amount of time up front, doing the research, doing the homework, connecting with locals like myself that really understand these little micro neighborhoods that exist all around Denver. And that way, you want to make sure that you're able to pick a place that you're happy with, not just with the home, but also the lifestyle that it provides. Because again, it's not simply about just the home, it's about the lifestyle that that neighborhood provides you, and everything else is going to be a lot easier to deal with if you at least get into that right location. If you guys also want, I have a really helpful guide. It's my Locals Guide to Denver. It's over 20 of my personal favorites, as well as just the most popular parts of Denver. And it goes into depth on, best restaurants, what schools are in the area, all kinds of demographic info, as well as just some local favorite spots within each of these. So if you guys want a free copy of that too, just go to adamshillsdenver.com, click Helpful Guides, and get yourself a copy there. I look forward to seeing you guys on a brand new episode next week. Until then, have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you guys then. Bye.